Hi, I'm Paul Pepis. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. I want to welcome you to this, the fifth and final lecture of the OHC's Eugene Public Lecture Series on this year's theme of connection. As usual, I have a few quick announcements up front before I introduce the speaker. Our information table is in that little antechamber there, which has information about our programs, and you can sign up for our newsletter there. We're live streaming the lecture today, so and our speaker has agreed to do Q&A after the lecture, and then a book signing in the lobby afterwards. So for the Q&A, you can see that there are two microphones at the midpoint there. You'll need to come to the microphones to ask your question because we're streaming it so that the people who are watching it will be able to hear you. I also, as always, need to give some thanks. First, many thanks to our collaborators in EMU Event Services and at the Center for Media and Educational Technologies for their logistical and technical support. I'd like to thank the architects at Raoul Brokaw who have created this amazing new space, and Mark Young is the lead architect right there. And last but not least, I have to thank the amazing staff at the Oregon Humanities Center, our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, our Program Coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our Communications Coordinator, Peg Gerhardt, our Student Assistant, Megan Connor, for their incredible work. I'm lucky I work with the greatest staff on this campus. In fact, without the help of our incomparable staff and collaborators, the OHC would never be able to organize events like this and host major public intellectuals like our speaker tonight, writer and cultural critic William Deresiewicz. William Deresiewicz will present this year's Kritikos lecture in the Humanities. Established in 1993 through a generous gift from two of the OHC's loyal Portran patrons, the Kritikos professorship brings to the university and to the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities. From the Greek kritikos, translates roughly as able to judge, evaluate, and criticize. As the term suggests, the Kritikos professorship was created to foster the education of UO students and faculty and to promote intelligent, critical public discourse across the state. Kritikos professors are known for speaking their minds, even if what they have to say is provocative or unfashionable. Given both the professorship's aims and our theme of connection, William Deresiewicz was our immediate choice for the Kritikos professor for this year. In the summer of 2008, Deresiewicz published a bracing and controversial essay in the American Scholar titled "The Disadvantages of an Elite Education" that immediately went viral. It has now received over 1 million hits. In 2009, he delivered an equally provocative speech at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, later published in the American Scholar, called "Solitude of Leadership," that also went viral. Clearly, his challenging and timely arguments have struck a powerful chord, or I should say touched a raw nerve with the American public. William Deresiewicz is a contributing writer for The Nation, a contributing editor for The New Republic, and the author of 2 books, A Jane Austen Education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter, and Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of America and the Way to a Meaningful Life, the latter of which has generated hundreds of commentaries, irate and admiring, and provoked a searching, sometimes searing conversation about the state of American higher education, leadership, and society. His lecture tonight, "What is College For? A Defense of the Liberal Arts," promises to be no less provocative, determined, and critical. Please join me in welcoming William Deresiewicz.
Thanks for coming. I think I'm going to get comfortable here. You know, I live in Oregon. I live in Portland, but I've been in LA for the semester. And this is the first time I'm back. It's nice to come back. The clouds are kind of home, feel like home. The food, nothing like Oregon food, the best. Seriously. And so it's fun to be here. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm an Oregonian because it's only been 7 or 8 years. I think it might take that many decades before I really feel like a native. But I make my home here. And thanks for selecting me for this. I definitely have the critical part covered. A friend of mine said, I used to think that you touched a nerve, now I think you've severed an artery. Which I have to say, I like when metaphors of violence are applied to my work, but talk about that later. The connections part, I think if anything, I'm here to destroy connections, but we'll see about that. Thanks for everyone who's making this possible, whom I've met today and hope we'll meet more tomorrow. The live stream, if there's anyone watching in your dorm room, I was thinking you could turn this maybe into a drinking game. You just do a shot every time I say liberal arts. See if you make it to the end. I think they call this warming up the crowd. I'm not going to... If somebody wants to ask me about this in the Q&A, you can. But I'm not... I mean, sometimes I start these talks by giving the history of the book that I wrote, Excellent Sheep, which explains, why I wrote it. And the short answer is because students want to talk about this stuff. And they want to talk about their sense that the education they're getting is not what it should be. But I'm not going to take the time to do that because I want to have lots of time to present the other half of the argument, which is perhaps clumsily encapsulated in the second half of that very long subtitle, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. I want to talk about the second part, and I want to talk about what the liberal arts have to do with that and what the liberal arts mean. And it's going to be drawn from the book, just so you know. The phrase you always hear when people talk about college is return on investment. I was actually asked to be on Fox Business News a couple of years ago, and that's the question they asked. And I said, what's the return supposed to be? I mean, is it just financial, right? Is it just about earning more money? Is the only purpose of going to college to get a job? These are the questions that no one asks or even thinks to ask in the overheated conversation we have been having about higher education lately. We talk about soaring tuition, rising student debt, and the daunting labor market for new graduates. And it's appropriate that we do that. We talk about the future of the university, budget squeezes, distance learning, MOOCs, massive open online courses, about which I think the best thing to say is, it's better than nothing. Which is what some students are getting now. And whether college in its present form is even necessary. We talk about national competitiveness, the 21st century labor force, technology, engineering, the outlook for our future prosperity, but we never talk about the premises that underlie those questions, as if what makes for a happy life and a good society were simply self-evident, as if in either case the exclusive answer were more money. By the way, to anticipate, the questions of what makes for a happy life and a good society are precisely the questions that should lie at the heart of college education. They're questions that we the things that we put to question rather than taking for granted. Now, money matters, okay? I would never claim that it doesn't. Jobs matter, financial security matters, national prosperity matters. The question is, are they the only things that matter? Life is more than a job. A job is more than a paycheck. And you are more than your ability to contribute to your employer's bottom line or the nation's GDP, no matter what the rhetoric of politicians or executives or parents would have you think. Okay, when we ask what college is for, we're asking what life is for, what society is for, or to steal a phrase from Kurt Vonnegut, what people are for. That's really what's that's really ultimately what's at issue. When people give you an education and tell you what it's about. And I think that's a big source of dissatisfaction among so many students, is the sense that this isn't just about college. Students, again, almost never hear this. You hear this drumbeat in the public discourse and often on college campuses that seeks to march you in the opposite direction. When policymakers talk about higher education, sadly to say, from our president all the way down, they talk exclusively in terms of math and science. Journalists and pundits, some of whom were humanities majors and none of whom are nurses or engineers, never tire of lecturing the young about the necessity of thinking prudently when choosing a course of study. The naivete of wanting to learn things just because you're curious about them. So top 10 majors means the most employable, not the most interesting. Top 10 fields means average income, not job satisfaction. What are you going to do with that? The inevitable sneering question goes. Liberal arts has become a put-down, and English major a punchline. I am in grave danger of digressing way too much, but let me just say that I've realized that those sneering questions that are always put to people who want to study things like English or political science or even pure math, they say a lot about the questioner. Why is it that everybody seems to feel not only empowered but obligated to police young people that way? Where else in society do we do that? I'll tell you where else. We say it to women about getting married and having children. To men too, but especially women. In other words, everybody feels empowered and indeed obligated to put pressure on you to, in this land of the free and the individual and people who are going off track, to live a very certain normative life. So if anybody ever asks you those questions, ask yourself or ask them why it's so important to them to know. Now, you need to get a job, right? But you also need to get a life. We ask what's the return on investment of college. We might as well ask what's the return on investment of having children or spending time with your friends or reading books or listening to music. The things that are most worth doing are worth doing for their own sake. And anyone who tells you that the sole purpose of an education is the acquisition of negotiable skills is attempting to reduce you to a productive employee at work, a gullible consumer in the market, and a docile subject of the state. The word for this is neoliberalism, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow in Portland. This idea that we have value only insofar as we are actors in the marketplace. Now, I'm going to say that the first thing that college is for is to teach you to think, and if you're the audience, I hope you are, you're going to roll your eyes because it's a cliche, but it actually means something, and I think it means what I mean by it is not what's normally meant by it. What's normally meant by it is the acquisition of analytic skills that help you in your professions, right? So you learn to analyze a text, and that's going to make you a good lawyer, and that may actually be true, but that's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is developing the habit of skepticism and the capacity to put it into practice. It means learning not to take things for granted so you can reach your own conclusions. And if you want a one-sentence explanation of what I mean by the way to a meaningful life, that's what I mean. Being able to figure out for yourself what matters to you. Because before you can learn, you have to unlearn. You don't arrive in college as a blank slate. You arrive having already been inscribed with all the ways of thinking and feeling that the world has been instilling in you since the moment you were born. The myths, the narratives, the pieties, the assumptions, the sacred words. Your soul, in the words of Alan Bloom, is a mirror of what is around you. I always noticed as a teacher of freshmen that my students could be counted on to produce an opinion about any given subject the moment I introduced it. And it wasn't because they necessarily thought about that particular subject, as that their minds were like a chemical bath of conventional attitudes that would precipitate out of solution and coat the subject like in a hard, impenetrable shell. But before the old people laugh too much, I would say that this is not a phenomenon confined to 18-year-olds. Society is a conspiracy to keep itself from the truth. We pass our lives submerged in propaganda, advertising messages, political rhetoric, the journalistic affirmation of the status quo, the platitudes of popular culture, the axioms of party, sect, and class, the bromides we exchange every day on Facebook, the comforting lies our parents tell us and the sociable ones our friends do, the steady stream of falsehoods that we each tell ourselves all the time to stave off the threat of self-knowledge. Plato called this doxa, opinion, which is where words like orthodox or heterodox come from. And it is as powerful a force among progressives as among conservatives, in Oregon as in Mississippi, for atheists as for fundamentalists. I didn't fully realize how undereducated progressives could be until I moved to Oregon. Listen, I live in the city that's voted down fluoridation 3 times, so I know what I'm talking about. This first purpose of a real education, of a liberal education, is to liberate us from doxa by teaching us to recognize it, to question it, and to think our way around it. One of my favorite writers about education, UVA professor, English professor Mark Edmondson, has a great book called Teacher, where he describes the man who played this role for him. And his teacher's methods were the same as Socrates, Plato's own teacher. He echoed his students' opinions back to them, or forced them to articulate them for themselves. And by dragging them into the light, forcing you to defend them or just acknowledge having them, he began to break them down, to expose them to the operations of the critical intelligence, and thus to develop that intelligence in the first place. The point was not to replace his students' opinions with his own. The point was to bring his students into the unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and endlessly fertile condition of doubt. He was teaching them not what to think, but how. Digression. As a professor this semester at a liberal arts college, I had a lot to say about teaching students what to think rather than how. I hope and suspect that the strain of flesh-eating bacteria known as political correctness is less virulent here, if only because it's a public university and a large university. But unfortunately, I think there's a fair amount of teaching what to think. But you can ask me about that if you want to. Now, why is college particularly good for this? The truth is that Edmondson's book is actually about a high school teacher. Well, people say college isn't the real world, but that's the first thing that's good about college for this, right? It gives you an opportunity to stand outside, or should, for a few years, outside the world, between the orthodoxy of your family and the exigencies of career, and contemplate things for a distance. You can start, in theory, to do this in high school, but your parents are breathing down your neck. Your framework is very narrow. It's not an accident that college happens at the beginning of young adulthood, which is precisely when these kinds of fundamental questions should start to be asked. And indeed, I think it's usually the most intense time of this kind of asking. College also offers you professors. It's possible to learn to think on your own, but the chances are slim or smaller, right? Because a professor's most important role is to make you think with rigor, precisely, patiently, responsibly, remorselessly, and not only. And I'm quoting my professor, my mentor. He happens to have an Oregonian connection because he was the brother of Ursula K. Le Guin, Karl Kroeber, quite a family that. He wrote once, he's not alive anymore, he wrote once that the job of a professor is to make you think not only about your deepest ingrained presuppositions, but, and I love this, about your most exhilarating new insights, most of which turn out to be fallacious. Again, that doesn't just apply to college students. You want some people in your life whose job it is to tell you when you're wrong, and that's what professors should be doing. We can discuss grade inflation later if we'd like. College also offers you peers with whom to question and debate the ideas you encounter in the classroom. Late-night bull sessions is another one of those phrases that people like to throw at the college experience to shame students out of their intellectual appetite. But the classroom and the dorm room are two ends of the same stick. The first puts ideas in your head, the second makes them part of your soul. The first requires stringency, the second offers freedom. The first is normative, the second is subversive. The classroom is merely the grain of sand. It's up to you to make the pearl. College is not the only chance to learn to think. It's not the first, it's not the last, but it generally is the best. And if you haven't started at all by the time you graduate, it's probably going to be pretty hard to start afterwards, if only because life is going to engulf you. This is why an undergraduate experience devoted exclusively to career preparation is 4 years largely wasted. The purpose of college, what is college for? Is to enable you to live more alertly, more responsibly, more freely, more fully. I visited a liberal arts college a few years ago, and I had lunch with a couple of seniors, and one of them said, the question I leave college with is how to put my feminist ideals into practice as I go forward. And while I liked the word ideals, I really loved the first noun, question. College should send you into the world bearing questions, not just resumes. Now, learning how to think is only the beginning. There's one thing in particular that you need to learn to think about, and that's yourself. Another professor of mine who was a legendary teacher used to say to his freshmen that you're here for very selfish reasons. You're here to build a self. Now, we might recoil from that word selfish, but I find it strange that we would in an environment that's telling students that the purpose of college is to get a high-paying job. Like, that's not selfish, but the other thing is selfish. Like, it's not selfish to work on Wall Street, but it is selfish to study philosophy. But what does this mean to build a self? David Foster Wallace wrote about today's young people that we've taught them that a self is something you just have. Now, it's not that you don't have one at all when you're a kid. It's just there isn't that much to it. I mean, when I say you, I'm also talking about myself, right? I'm talking from my own experience. John Keats, the great romantic poet, who I'm going to be talking about for the next couple of minutes, called the world a veil of soul-making. It's one of my all-time favorite phrases. He's playing on the Christian notion of the world as a vale of tears, a valley of tears, that the soul passes through on the way to a salvation that lies beyond this world. And he's talking, and that traditional phrase understands the word soul in a traditionally religious sense, this thing that somehow isn't quite the self or is somehow detached from the earthly self and is in any case only concerned with matters of good and evil. What Keats meant by soul, and what I mean by soul, is our earthly self, understood in its totality, moral, intellectual, sensual, sexual, emotional, our whole being. And by calling the world not a veil of tears but a veil of soul-making, Keats is saying that experience is itself the crucible of the soul's creation. He writes, "Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul?" Think about that first of all, the necessity of pain and trouble. The world is still a scene of sorrow in Keats, but it's also a scene of pleasure and joy. Quote, "A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways." The heart feels, he says, and the intelligence, we might say the consciousness, is educated by reflecting on that feeling. Everyone is born with a mind, but it is only through this act of introspection, of self-examination, of establishing communication between the mind and the heart, the mind and experience, that you become an individual, a unique being, a soul. And that's what it means to develop a self. Again, what does college have to do with this? Well, college helps or should help furnish you with the tools with which to undertake that work of self-discovery. The job of college, the ultimate job, is to assist you, or if need be, force you, to start on your way through the veil of soul-making. Books, ideas, works of art and thought, the pressure of the minds around you that are looking for their own answers in their own ways, all these are incitements, disruptions, violations. They make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. If you find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself, you are on the right track. Alan Bloom again. True liberal education requires that the student's whole life be radically changed. Liberal education puts everything at risk and requires students who are able to risk everything. Another digression. A friend of mine who works at the intersection between art and business and has a lot of interesting things to say about both, has taught me the distinction between what she calls design thinking and art thinking. And unfortunately, there's a lot more of the first, even in the arts, and a lot less of the second. Design thinking is, we want to get to point B. We want to design a smartwatch. So how are we going to do that? Art thinking starts from point A, and it doesn't know where it's going to end up. Its destination is a question mark. Its destination emerges in the process of exploration. Your attitude about your college and about your life should be art thinking and not design thinking. You shouldn't go to college to become an X, unless X is adult. The process is not comfortable, but it is exhilarating. There's nothing academic about it, nothing that is merely fun, in the way that people talk about an interesting class being fun. If it happens right, it feels like you're being broken apart, like you're giving birth to yourself. Lewis Lapham, the former editor of Harper's, quotes an old professor, "An education is a self-inflicted wound." Now, I've been talking about college in general, but I want to talk about the liberal arts in particular. Here's where things get a little complicated, because that word liberal arts that phrase is not well understood. It's generally used to mean the humanities now. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about, the humanities. The liberal arts, strictly speaking, include the sciences and social sciences as well. They are all the fields in which knowledge is pursued for their own sake, which is why, another digression, but I think tomorrow night I'm going to talk about this more. People who care about college education, and in particular the humanities, need to realize that what we're facing, and have been facing for decades, is not an assault on the humanities per se. It's an assault on all the liberal arts. And if you look at the numbers, you find that while the number of humanities majors has dropped precipitously since the 1960s, the number of physical science majors, physics, chemistry, geology, astronomy, has dropped even more. People don't study pure math anymore. If you tell people that you're a political science major, they'll give you the same kind of shit that they give you if you say that you're a philosophy major. And almost all the fields that are growing because they're seen as practical and vocational. Econ, business, communications, biology, generally as a pre-med path, even the visual and performing arts. I'm not against any of those per se. What I am against is the fact that these narrowly practical ideas are driving why students are going to college, what they're studying, and what everyone tells them their education should be about. So it is true that the liberal arts, even in the broader sense, are under assault. And they're under assault precisely because they are those fields in which knowledge is pursued for its own sake. Who the hell is going to pursue knowledge for its own sake anymore? Well, hopefully a 20-year-old will. But the whole world is going to be telling you that you're being stupid because you want to be smart. Okay. The humanities. The humanities, and I say this with great respect and even affection for the sciences and social sciences. I was a science major myself. My dad was an engineer. My big siblings were science majors. There's something that the humanities can do that these other disciplines can't. because the humanities are specifically concerned with asking the kinds of questions that I've been talking about, questions of meaning and purpose. History, philosophy, religious studies, the study of literature and the other arts address the questions. They are the record of the ways that people have come to terms with being human. Right? They don't study the physical world. They study what we have, the way people in the past have answered these questions, which is where you have to start if you want to answer them for yourself. You can't just do it out of thin air. They address the questions that are proper to us, not as this or that kind of specialist, this or that kind of professional, but as individuals as such. The very questions we are apt to ask when we look up from our work and think about our lives. Questions of love, death, family, morality, time, truth, God, and everything else within the wide, starred universe of human experience. The humanities are what we have in a secular society instead of religion. They are compatible with religion, but they have also in important ways supplanted it. As traditional beliefs were broken down across the 18th and 19th century by the skeptical critique of the Enlightenment, by the development of modern science, the humanities, the arts, emerged as the place where educated people went to contemplate those questions of meaning and value and purpose. Now the truth was multiple and personal, not settled and dogmatic. Instead of looking in the Bible, you read Dostoevsky, or listened to Beethoven, or went to an Ibsen play. Libraries, museums, and theaters became the new churches, places where you came to court the old emotions of catharsis, transcendence, redemption, and joy. Whitman said, with his characteristic modesty, the priest departs, the divine literatus comes. It's no coincidence that English became an object of university study around the very time that this idea was being crystallized in the late 19th century. So the center of the curriculum swung from the Greek and Latin classics, often taught by rote as fixed bodies of knowledge, to English and the other humanities. But it was really a form of continuity. As you probably know, many, certainly private colleges in this country were started as church-affiliated institutions, and many of them broke that connection over the course of the 19th century, maybe early 20th century, but they essentially kept the same mission under the sign of the arts, right? This is why we have not just English departments, but great books courses, core curricula, general education requirements. I hear you have some of those here. They may be some matter of controversy. Places where students are supposed to go to ask the big questions. So, if the humanities are central to liberal education and the study of the arts is central to the humanities, we need to talk about what claim art has to the truth. If the truth is so hard to come by, which it is, which is why we have these large apparatuses of the liberal arts and very smart people studying them to try to jostle a small truth out of a very difficult thing, how does an artist manage without this kind of same rigorous academic training? Well, my answer is by looking very hard and long, and then working very hard and long to tell us what they saw. That to me is what artists do at the core. If you've ever literally tried to paint or even draw a scene or an object, you will understand just how difficult that is. How much concentration it takes, let alone skill, to begin literally to see an object in front of you. To perceive, say, a cup of water, not simply as an instrument of use, something that you barely glance at as you satisfy your thirst, but in the full particularity of its material existence. The liquid color of the glass, the fingerprints around the middle, the rim of light at the meniscus, the shape of the translucent shadow that it casts. You know, Vladimir Nabokov, one of the great observers and noticers in literature, has said that shadows have colors. Most people pass their lives never even noticing that. If you've never done this, I mean, the first time I was asked in a course, it was actually after college, to actually look at things, I realized that I had passed my life completely oblivious to the world around me. So, try it. As with painting, so with every art. In literature, what is observed is not primarily the physical world, but the psychological and social ones. The poet looks at what she really feels about her body or her sister, not what she's supposed to feel. The novelist reports on the way we really treat each other, the pettiness or callousness or secret irrational longing, not the way we say we do. Those conventional modes of thought and emotion from which you need to free yourself, the party lines we spout, the happy talk that we're surrounded by, are exactly what art does its work by breaking through. There's a reason we avoid the truth with our sociable lies and our psychological blocks, which is that it's usually very hard to bear. Kafka said in one of my other favorite quotations that a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. That's what I was thinking about before when I said that education is like being broken open. John Ruskin, the greatest art critic of the 19th century, as well as one of its greatest social critics, a crucial influence on Gandhi, on Tolstoy, on Proust, on many others, one of my personal heroes, he put it like this: the more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. And if you think that he's using the word seeing metaphorically, you have completely misunderstood him. He means literally. Our eyes slide over the world as we obsess about our grades, or our sex life, or our incomes. Our mind slides over it. Art, to paraphrase the poet Shelley, bursts the spirit's sleep. Sometimes I feel when I talk about these things that I should be put in a time capsule and unearthed in 3 centuries, because I recognize that some of these things are not very popular opinions, or even very circulated opinions anymore. Including this notion that there's another form of truth that's not scientific truth. We live in an age that's not just scientific, but scientistic, which means it's an age that believes that science is the only form of truth, objective, quantifiable, reproducible, and that other disciplines are true only insofar as they approach science. This is one of the terrible things that's happened to the social sciences and even the humanities in the last few decades. They're all trying to become quantifiable. But I don't think we will ever have an adequate defense of the arts and humanities as long as we concede that point and forget that humanistic knowledge is different. It isn't verifiable. It isn't quantifiable. It isn't even reproducible. It changes from culture to culture and person to person. It is not a matter of calculation. It's a matter of interpretation. When we engage in humanistic inquiry, which means when we think about a poem or talk about a piece of music, we ask not how big is it or how hot is it or what does it consist of, but what does it mean? We ask of a scientific proposition, is it true? But of a proposition in the humanities, we ask, is it true for me? Which also means that to assert the value of the humanities and of the arts is to assert the value of individual experience in the face of many things, the many ways in which we are homogenized and reduced to a population, whether it's by a statistician or a search algorithm. This is one respect in which being the student, the reader of literature and the arts is similar to being a citizen, which is a word we don't hear very much anymore. It's about the absolute validity of individual experience, of individual judgment. So, is it true for me? By which I mean not, does it make sense to me, but does it make sense of me? The highest function of art and of literature in particular is to bring us to that knowledge of ourselves that college ought to start to give us. My friend Mark Edmondson, he actually, literally my friend, says, the ultimate reason to read the classic authors is to see if they may know you better than you know yourself. I heard from a psychiatrist who uses literature as a tool of practice. I should actually say that I cyberstalked a psychiatrist who used literature as a tool of practice. I had written something about a collection of Tolstoy stories, and I heard from this guy. He wrote this very wise, long email to me about Tolstoy, and he gave his name and his town, his location, and it's a small town in Maine, and it was an unusual name, and I thought, I'm interested in this guy, so I Googled him and I found out he was a psychiatrist, and I said, listen, I found out you're a psychiatrist, and I'm really curious if you use literature as a tool of practice. And he said, yes, I do. And he wrote me another long, fascinating, eloquent email. And one of the things he said was, I recently terminated a 6-year course of treatment with a man who was initially referred because he had become addicted to narcotics. He was a deeply depressed, inhibited, bitter, and unfulfilled person. I suggested that he read D.H. Lawrence. And in this case, a rare exception, he took me up on the offer. The challenge, really, and for most of his treatment, Lawrence was our constant companion. When I was a kid, the psychiatrist went on, people found themselves in literature. I found myself, for the first time when I was 14, he writes, in The Catcher in the Rye. No more. But this man would come in and read to me from Lawrence and say, that's me. That's me. The essential experience of art. We see ourselves in the other, and the other in ourselves. And this is also how art expands the boundaries of the self, not in a narcissistic way, but quite the opposite. Edmondson speaks of, quote, the incessant labor of combining your own experience, taken in and metabolized by intense feeling and thought, with what you have acquired in books. Art and life, back and forth, each illuminating the other, both together creating a self. So now we're back to Keats, right? To the intelligence being schooled by self-reflection on experience. But what Edmondson is adding, and Keats certainly understood this, is that art helps us uniquely to do this. I've used the word soul a number of times, and though I'm not religious, I find that only a religious language has sufficient gravity to do these questions justice. For we are speaking of the most important thing, no less a thing than how to live. We might propose then that you should arrive at college as at the beginning of a pilgrimage, a movement toward the truth and toward the self, that you should come to seek conversion, though you know not yet to what belief or way, that you should approach ideas as instruments of salvation, driven by a need to work things through for yourself, so that you won't be damned to go through life at second hand, thinking other people's thoughts and dreaming other people's dreams. Like your parents' dreams. It's been said that people, I love this, it's been said that people go to monasteries to find out why they went to a monastery. Which is wonderful, I think, and I think that college ought to be the same. We are born once, not only into nature, but into a culture that quickly becomes a second nature. But then, if we are granted such grace, we are born again. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his mortal soul? Far from only training workers to contribute to the GDP, or even citizens to play a role within the common sphere, a true education, like a true religion, enables us to stand apart, and if necessary, against the claims that others make upon us. This is part of what I had in mind when I said that I think I will be speaking on, in the matter of connection, I think I will be speaking on the negative side of the question. The self is a separate space, a private space, a space of strength, security, autonomy, creativity, play. You can live without a soul, D.H. Lawrence said, on ego and will alone. You can, quote, go on, keep on, and rush on, which sounds like the description of a lot of people I know, college students and otherwise, going on, keeping on, and rushing on. But you want it very much inside you. Such people, E.M. Forster has a character remark, this is in Howard's End, are incapable of saying I, which is counterintuitive. He's talking about people who are very egotistical and are very interested in acquisition and self-aggrandizement, but he says they can't say I. They can't even say I want, he says, because I want must lead to the question, who am I? So they only say want without the I. Want money, want mansion, want Harvard. There's a book called Higher Education with a question mark, and it's a pretty good book. And the authors remark that the purpose of college is to make you a more interesting person, which I love. I think it's a good definition, as long as we stipulate that the person to whom it is most important to be interesting is yourself, if only because that's the person you're going to have to spend the rest of your life with. But we must stipulate that being interesting is very different from what David Brooks might refer to as credentialed self-actualization. Being, as sad to say, being a quadruple major or a major with 2 minors, I met some today, does not make you interesting. Certainly not in itself. Editing the college newspaper while singing in an a cappella group, playing a sport, starting a nonprofit, and learning how to cook exotic grains. This does not make you interesting. Interesting is not accomplished. Interesting is not impressive, right? Impressive is what you want to be so other people can call you impressive. And friends of yours can say, I have this really impressive friend. They know how to cook exotic grains. What makes you interesting, especially to yourself, is reading, thinking, slowing down, having long conversations, and creating a rich inner life for yourself. Margaret Atwood has a character say, I might as well get an education, and goes on to reflect, that's how they talked about it, as if an education were a thing you got, like a dress. It should be obvious by now that the most problematic part of that idea is the word you. You don't get an education. You is the variable in that expression. You is what an education operates upon. Education is what's left over, goes the common jeer, after you've forgotten everything you've learned. But surprisingly enough, the person who first formulated that idea was a guy named James B. Conant, who became the longtime president of Harvard, and quite a great academic leader, too. And he did not mean it as a slur. Most of what you come across in college will inevitably fade from memory. What's left over, precisely, is you. Thank you. Yeah, come to the microphone to ask questions. I'll alternate. If you need to leave, it's fine, go ahead. I mean, now would be a good time. Go ahead.
I had always, as of late anyway, thought that one of the problems with modern education is the way the educators are trained, and that the education departments have been shifted from the humanities more towards social sciences or other areas that do try to do the quantification that you were talking about. Would you comment on whether you feel I'm off base, or how that might be effective in educating teachers going forward?
You know, I mean, you're really asking about K through 12, and it's really not something I know very much about. Listen, I hear the same terrible things about education programs that everybody does. And there seems to be a lot of stuff that's screwed up with K through 12 education. I don't doubt that what you're talking about is part of it. Education theory, education, I don't know, as some kind of analytic discipline. To me, teaching is a craft. And, you don't, it's like throwing a pot or playing guitar or hitting a baseball. And, I would think that it should be taught as a craft, which means every child is different, just like every lump of clay is different. But I really don't have the expertise to talk about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, how are you? Is it on?
Yeah, just...
Okay, very basic question, but what did you major in college and why did you pick that?
I'm really glad you asked me that. What did I major in college and why did I pick it? You asked the perfect question.
I know.
Do you know? You know the answer?
No.
Okay. I was a biopsychology major. And I picked it because I had a great biology teacher, two of them actually, in junior high and high school, and I loved biology, and I was really interested in psychology, but I'd never studied it. And like the first week I got to college, it was literally freshman orientation. I was looking through the course catalog, and I saw that there was a joint major in biopsychology. It's the field, it was very embryonic, it was the early 80s. It ended up becoming like cognitive science. And that's what I decided to study right then and there, and it was one of the stupidest decisions I'd ever made. And ultimately, when I talk about drawing on personal experience for this book, that's one of the key experiences, because I feel like I largely wasted my college education. I'm someone, I know we live in a culture that often says that, you shouldn't regret things. I believe deeply in regret. And I have profound regrets, and I feel like that decision cost me years of my life, and it was made for all the wrong reasons. I did not give college a chance to show me what else could be out there. I didn't give myself a chance to think about what I really cared about. I seized on something because I think I was afraid of the tremendous possibility that college offered. It, not coincidentally, was something that made my parents happy because it was in the sciences. What are you majoring in?
I was a double major in international studies and journalism. Now I'm just journalism.
How did you make that decision?
Well, I want to work in TV, and the classes there kind of skill-wise matched up the most. And international studies, I want to live on every continent by the time I turn 30, so that kind of made sense. You laugh, but that's true. So just before I go, if you could go back and pick another major now, knowing what you know now, what would you do?
Well, it's what I ultimately did do. I 4 years after college was over, I went and started a PhD program in English. The fact that I was sitting in my freshman science classes reading novels under my desk should have told me, should have told me something. But nobody helped me to understand not what I should pick, but how I should go about doing it. So again, it's not that any one field is better than another. It's how you make the choice.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, a question about curriculum. And as you were speaking, I was thinking that you were kind of leaning more towards the classical writers and feeling like these are the folks, the giants that we need to read more of, perhaps. And as you know, with the curriculum changing, students aren't reading as much Shakespeare, perhaps not reading Proust at all, but reading more Native American writers, reading different voices. Is that a concern for you, or do you feel like it doesn't really matter what you read, it's how you read it?
Yeah, more the second. I mean, my chapter on that, and it's part of what I was reading tonight, is called Great Books, but it means not the great books with a capital G and a capital B, but small g and small b. Any book that can do that Kafka meat axe thing. Here's the right, and it doesn't matter who wrote it or when, but here's actually my concern. You asked how we read, right? It often seems to be the case to me that along with the changes in the syllabi are also changes in how we read. And when syllabi are constructed as kind of demographic as a kind of demographic census, it often goes along with an attitude that reading should serve other ends than the ones I'm talking about, that they should serve some kind of programmatic, ideological, or political end. And it could be from the right as well as from the left. And I came across a really great idea that apparently originates in Schopenhauer, although I read it in a contemporary essayist, that to read correctly is to cooperate with the book's attempt to teach you something. And I often find that people bring literature in front of a classroom now, especially the dead white men. I'm going to be a dead white man pretty damn soon, so I don't have as much animus against them as other people. But they bring literature in front of the classroom to debunk it, to lecture it, to show its shortcomings, rather than to learn something from it. But no, I mean, it's not about it's not about the classics for me.
Hi, my name is David Moran. I want to say first off, thank you for coming down to Eugene. I read your excellent sheet in, I think, February, and as a testament to how it validated every major choice I've made in my undergraduate career, from going to an elite university to transferring back to a public university. I took the liberty of reading most of the secondary readings and sites that were in that, and then some of those primary sources. And in my exploration, I reflected on two things. One, that that endeavor cost nothing, because I got every single book from a library. The second is this conflict in the justification of college in its conflicting ideological means versus financial practicality. And while that disparity is bigger at colleges where you're paying more money, the truth is still the same. And so your last point, talking about as if it was to get an education, as if it was to get a dress, where you is the variable, okay? That's implying then that the self, myself in particular, is the variable in which I am justifying my expenses towards coming to college, okay? And it seems ironic, to say the least, that you could put a value on that, right? And just to consider how, my self-education has led me to that ends, rather than something I did pay for. Why then would the institution of education be the only means, or the means that I would, justify paying for?
Yeah, listen, I mean, again, you don't have to go to college, and there are certainly people who self-educate, and certainly the purpose of college is to help you continue to self-educate, right? To teach you to self-educate. So listen, that's what I would say a couple of things. Colleges don't sell learning; they sell credentials. It is still true. I mean, I think the cost of higher education, especially public higher education, is completely screwed up. It's our fault. We need to tax ourselves more. By we, I mean, the top 10, 15%. Lost my train of thought. But, yes. Despite the fact that college costs much more than it should, it actually still is a good investment. Because in today's economy, if you don't have that credential, you're really screwed. But that's a separate issue. If we're talking about getting an education, yeah, you can do it without college. Good for you. I gave a bunch of reasons today why I think college should help you with that. It's also true that colleges, less and less, are actually doing what they should be doing. And anyone will tell you, some people told me this today. They said, I got a really good education here, but I had to go and find it myself. I had to basically fight the institution to get it by finding the right professors, going to their office hours, yada, yada, yada. I agree. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
To what extent would you say the things you've been talking about today apply to people enrolled in graduate programs? Not just in the humanities, but in like the sciences and engineering, and like how much does that change in where you're at, change how you should look at developing a soul in school?
Well, I actually think it does change. I do. I think graduate school is about something different. And it really is about, I've made at least a tentative choice about what I want to do with my life, and I need to acquire certain skills and certain credentials in order to help me to do that. And the job of this school is now, I mean, if we're talking about PhD programs, in some sense it should be different. But if we're talking about most graduate programs, which are professional programs, their job is vocational. And that's okay. But I mean, I would say that makes it even more urgent that you not devote your college exclusively to vocational education, because you're probably going to get more of that anyway. But what's on your mind? Why are you asking me that? No, I mean, there's always something behind someone's question, and I'm just wondering, are you in a graduate program now, or are you thinking of...
No, I'm going to be next year, but you wrote your book at the beginning of my senior year of college, which is really inconvenient. And I didn't read it until winter break when I was on a long road trip. So you've left me 2 quarters to try and digest this and change stuff. So, yeah.
Sorry, man.
But if I could ask a sneaky second question. If you have a 10-second blurb on what the difference between a PhD program and like a vocational program would be in grad school, just because that's where I'm going.
Which one are you going to?
A PhD program.
In what field?
Physics.
Well, a PhD program should, in theory, be about intellectual exploration. In practice, more and more, PhD programs will also become professional, vocational programs. I think physics is as valid an arena of intellectual exploration and curiosity as any humanities program. But I suspect that there are great differences between programs in your field in terms of how much they give you room to cultivate that. And I hope that is it something you can see while you're applying? Can you try to make a choice between programs on that basis?
You kind of have to go to their in-house, bring everybody in, feed them, and tell them how special they are, and tell them to go to their school. And you have to meet them and see how willing they are to bend the rules and what kind of stuff they're interested in, rather than whether or not they just want you to spend 60 hours a week at a computer finding cool things out.
And can you kind of tell before you enroll whether you're likely to have a real intellectual experience? Or do you have to just kind of roll the dice?
Take the top 15 grad schools in your particular school and just dump them in the trash, and then look down further.
Good advice for college too, I think.
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to try and be brief with this. It has something to do with back to the question that was just asked at this mic, so maybe that's not what you're feeling like talking about. I asked a question of a lot of panelists and lecturers who come in that's related to this. But in any event, I like a lot of the things you're saying about what the purpose of higher education should be and all. I dropped out for 5 years. I finished 3, came back after that. Some of those things you've said about a lot of people who come and they say, I actually got a great education, but I had to go look for it. I find I'm doing a much better job in this one last year trying to squeeze things in. And that the reason I dropped out was I learned actually a lot more not being in school. And that school was prohibitive to my learning. But regardless of that, the real question is, here's a statistic about this university, for example, that I like to tell everyone. We get around
5%.
5%. So does public education
5% of your funds from the state.
Yeah, somewhere between 5 and 6 and 4.8 or whatever. I've heard different numbers. But yeah, and in California we're down to 12-ish. So does public education even exist anymore? And like, what can we do if what you're saying is totally like spot on and true? What can we do to actually make that reality instead of just some awesome lecture you give?
Listen, hey, I totally am on board with the last thing you said. I mean, that's not what's going to change things, right? I mean, I'm under no illusion that writing a book is like going to change certainly anything systematic. You get 5% of your funding from the state and 100% of your control, right? The state still controls it, more or less, right?
Well, I mean,
nominally, no. You're still under the aegis of the state.
It depends where the money goes. I mean,
okay,
we have great sports because Bill Knight gives a crap load of money. We have an awesome museum because Jordan Schnitzer donates a crap load of money, and those are pretty cool.
Okay, I hear you. I alluded to this before, and I know this is unthinkable, right? We once built, when we thought about our collective lives and our fellow citizens a little differently in the decades after World War II, great public systems of public higher ed. It wasn't just after World War II. It really started during the Civil War, right? So this long-term, 100-plus year project to create great institutions. And it was great. I mean, it was key to building the middle class. People who went to college...
Vanishing middle class.
The now vanishing middle class. But it was key to building the middle class after the war. And people say, oh, all this liberal arts stuff is great for the rich kids who go to Harvard and Yale, but average kids aren't interested. Bullshit, right? Because during the heyday of higher education, public higher ed, was also the heyday of the humanities major, right? Not a coincidence because college was free or very cheap. Then we decided to go in a different direction, and Ronald Reagan said the government shouldn't subsidize intellectual curiosity, and we figured out that we could get students to take out loans instead of taxpayers to pay taxes. 40 years later, we started to wake up to the incredible inequality that this and other aspects of Reaganomics has created, and we've started to push back. And we've started to do things that were unthinkable, like raising the minimum wage even in red states. And now our president, one of the good things he said was free community college. So I think that we're starting to see the beginning of a movement back. And what is unthinkable today will not necessarily be unthinkable tomorrow. And we massively undertax ourselves. All of our public needs are being underfunded. That's the big picture solution for me. So, does that answer your question?
That's a start. Thank you, though.
Hi, I thank you for coming, and I've read your book, and I really appreciated it. I was born sort of a convert to your message in a way because I was raised mostly by my grandfather, who went to Harvard in the 30s and then became an English teacher at Andover for 45 years, and so when I went to college, a little elite New England college, the message was major. Follow your heart, and I did that and went to an MFA program, and then I moved out west, which for me was kind of a shock in many ways. But I became a professor first at the University of Arizona and then here, and now I've been on the faculty senate this year at the University of Oregon, which I've been trying to channel some of your message into this. As I listen to the debates that can happen there, for instance, when our new Board of Trustees head, Chuck Lillis, comes and talks about the University of Oregon as entirely a private. He's just said it's a private university now, and money, 5%, and we need money. And the message essentially is, what's going to sell? You know what I mean? How can we sell? And then in a further discussion later on, of why we have amazing athletic facilities, but the English department's kind of looks like a circa 1958 Polish Warsaw building. You know what I mean? Why is that the case? And the message is, it's very simply, well, we can raise money for football, but we can't raise money for you weird people, over there. I mean, that's my translation. And so how do we translate what you're saying to? It feels like a room full of converts, to people who I feel like there's a very much two constituencies in the university, the faculty, and we're trying to say, hey, it's not really a corporation here, and we're losing the message. So the student who says to you, I have to go find my education and fight the institution, I have to fight the institution to give the education. So, I'm looking for some help.
Yeah. I've had it easy because I've never had to have those kinds of conversations with the people you're talking about. Off the top of my head, and granted this may be a strategy that backfires, but maybe ask them, what were the important experiences for you in college? What were the courses that you took? Who were the professors that inspired you? And maybe they'll start to self-reflect and realize. Another thing that I've been struck by is that the language that business has been talking about, I think this is this is because of Apple, and I think this dates from the introduction of the iPod in 2001. But that's when people, I think, started to talk about innovation, creativity. This is what they want. How are we going to get that from our educational system if we're just doing STEM and teaching to the test and Common Core? So you might pose that to them. You might suggest that you might show them that while we are desperately trying to emulate our East Asian competitors, they're desperately trying to emulate us because they want to know where they can get that American enzyme of creativity from. Why are we still the most innovative in all the fields that matter to people? They want to move up the value chain. What do we have that they don't have? I don't know if this is going to help. It might start to help.
I'd just like to hear your thoughts on what you think us older folks in our 70s and beyond ought to do to continue to try to figure ourselves out in this world, education-wise, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on that whole matter?
Listen, I think it's the same thing at every age. I still read books that make me rethink some of my deepest convictions. And, the more experience you have, what the young people don't realize is that you become a better and better reader of literature the older you get. And I taught adult classes for a year in graduate school, and it's a whole different experience. And people who have a whole life to draw on make a much richer sense of these books. So do you feel like you're having trouble figuring this out, or?
Yeah, because, in retirement, I went the route of following the wishes of others pretty much and majored in math and got a job with IBM and then retired. And now that I'm retired, I'm busy volunteering and doing all kinds of things that I have time for now, but not spending a lot of time reading, listening to talks, etc. And I kind of want to do more of that and less of staying still busy in retirement and striking that balance.
Listen, I don't have as much time to read as I wish I did, and I think it's because, we really have this religion of busyness now at every age, including college. And I think you need to, I find myself actively needing to resist it. Yeah. Thanks. I'm really glad that the older people are asking questions, people my age and older, but I would love to hear, are you a college student? No. Okay.
My son, this will be a quick question. My son will be coming here next fall as a freshman. He's very talented. He can do anything. And he has no choice as far as a major. So do you have words of wisdom?
You mean he hasn't decided on his major?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So any words of wisdom for his parents for the next 4 years or so?
Don't panic.
Okay.
Give him the room to figure it out. It sounds like he's a kid who will figure it out.
And thank you, because it was so clear to me that he was going to come here 2 years. We moved from Hawaii 3 years ago, never been to Oregon, came up here and I saw Matthew Knight Arena, and I said, Matthew, he was playing in a basketball tournament. They were state championships. But I saw Matthew Knight Arena, and I said, Matthew, his name is Matthew, and his school that he goes to, the mascot is the Knights. So I said, here you go, Matthew Knight. And then I was discerning he was torn between OSU and U of O. And at the 11th hour on May 1st, at 11:30 at night, we're shooting hoops, U of O, OSU, flipping coins. He still wasn't decided. And I had a real strong sense, call it divine providence. I had multiple signs of Matthew Knight and just repeated ducks, symbols. So there's that divine providence piece of, everyone has a purpose, I believe. And how do you create a room for that in the scheme of your discovering yourself?
Well, I would say, how do you, I thought you were going to say, how do you help him create room? You need to give him room, right?
Okay.
That's the thing. And if you do that, I think people naturally seek that room. And one of the things that makes it hardest for them to find it is parents who are too anxious and hovering too much and checking in too much and directing too much. And trust your kid, which is really just a way of saying trust your own parenting up until this point, that you've now created someone who can go forward. I say in the book to kids, when you get to college, don't call your parents more than once a week or if possible once a month. And people have said, that's great advice. Kid, if you follow it, I'll kill you.
Text instead, right? Thank you. Dziękuję.
Okay. Yes.
Hi. I think a mistake that we all make is that we assume that education happens in a classroom or 5 days a week or in 12 years of K-12 education or in 4 years of college, when actually it probably happens every day for the rest of your life. Right? Since I've graduated, I actually think I've probably learned more facts, more information from Wikipedia, for instance, than I did in 4 years of college. And I think set a goal for yourself to lead an active and curious life. And if you just set a goal to learn, let's say, 3 new things every day, by the time you die, your brain will probably be the size of this auditorium. But we shouldn't discount the practical things, too, in life. Including learning those 3 things, how to fry an egg. Something really basic, how to tie a knot, a certain type of ship knot. Or how to use a particular presentation graphics program, or how to use Adobe. Or how to make a website, how to use statistics. And these things won't actually come to you all at once at college, and you'll be enlightened. These are things that you're curious, and then you delve into the internet, and you Google it, and you read up about it. And I think we shouldn't see education as something that happens when you're 4 years at university. It's something that happens
I hear what you're saying.
For the rest of your life.
I hear what you're saying. I agree with you in part and disagree with you in part. I agree with you that it happens for your whole life. I will say that the formal part of your education, again, especially college, should prepare you to self-educate for the rest of your life. So it does have a specific role to play. Where I disagree with your implication is that while it's good to learn things, the kinds of things you can learn from Wikipedia, education fundamentally is not about learning information. It is not information transfer. And this is what's most wrong about the MOOCs, about online education, about a model of education that says that it's about taking information from one brain and transferring it to another brain. That is not what education is. It's about developing the potentialities that lie within you already. The word education means to draw out. It's about drawing out what's already inside you, which is part of what we mean by learning how to learn. And then, yes, then you're in a position to acquire whatever information you want, whatever skills you want, but that's not the essence of it. And when you equate education with information transfer, that's when you start to think that you can do without school, you can do without teachers, but you can't. You can't.
Can I counter that?
Sure.
Okay. I would say that information is zeros and ones. And if you were to look at the internet, a lot of it doesn't make any sense, okay? But the information, part of that information can become data, okay? But then data itself is something that needs to be analyzed and processed heavily. And a lot of data is garbage. And you have to sort out through the data to get the things that you want. And from the data, you might get maybe 5% of that is information, working information that's pertinent to your question at hand, something that you wanted to pursue all along. But that information itself is not knowledge. Just a fraction of that information is something that's probably worth studying and probably worth knowing for the rest of your life. And that knowledge is not wisdom. And wisdom actually is judgment and learning how to use knowledge in a way that's beneficial, that's practical, or that's long-term sustainable. And ultimately, wisdom is not making the right decisions. And that's what we need to arrive at. Being a good decider. Unfortunately, that's what Bush said, but that's what a president does. And sometimes you could skip all those other processes.
Okay, perhaps we don't disagree as much as I thought we do. But again, I think I'm just paraphrasing what you're saying. It's precisely because information is freely available everywhere now that you need to know what to do with it. And people, an item of information does not exist devoid of context. You need to know what to do, not just what to do with the information you find, but what information to look for. In other words, it's not about finding the answer to a question. It's about learning how to ask questions that haven't been asked before. And this is why you need guidance, at least when you're younger. Because you can't bootstrap your way to this all on your own. Okay?
Thanks for your wisdom.
You're welcome.
Speaking of needing guidance when you're younger, I'm an undergraduate music education major, and I'm looking to go into teaching. And I wanted to ask you, I know you're talking about teaching for the test and how that kind of inhibits creativity in the classroom, or can. And I was wondering, how can you move away from that style of teaching in the classroom so that you can create more critical thinking in the students, but also satisfy administrators' needs to quantify what you're teaching?
Listen, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And every teacher will tell you this, just like the professor, I'm not sure if he's still in the room, the one who said that he feels constrained by the system too. I don't literally have the answer to you, but I do know, listen, there are a lot of people who do this, right? Whether it's in Montessori schools or other kinds of independent schools that are not bound by these administrative needs. People know how to do this. I hope they teach you when they teach you in your education major. The problem is not that we don't know how to teach students to become critical questioners and citizens and all that stuff. It's that the way we think about education now is pushing in the opposite direction. And it's like, we need to create engineers. And the way we're going to create engineers is by having people do math sets from the time they're 5. And we're going to give them, as accountability and metrics. That's the problem. Not that we don't know the right way. It's that somehow the people who are making the decisions, and this is true of higher ed too, are often not education professionals. They think they know better than the professionals. The professionals don't have a seat at the table. A lot of this is driven by the kind of thinking that comes out of business schools that's not really applicable to education. Does this make sense? Okay, next. I'll be here until the last person is standing, so don't worry about the time. I don't care. Oh, were you at the microphone? Okay.
Thank you for taking my question. So you spoke a little bit about education becoming more of a luxury. And what would you say to the students who want to pursue higher education further than undergrad, who are hesitant in doing so because of the cost, especially after loans and interest?
And especially pursuing it after college to a graduate degree. Listen, I don't think you can ignore these issues. I'm not telling people don't worry about how much debt you're taking on. You really need to think about this stuff. So that's what I would say. Make that kind of calculation. Don't let yourself be buried by debt. On the other hand, don't be afraid of a little bit of debt. there are lots. I mean, listen, I know people, I have friends who literally did not finish paying off their loans until their early 40s. But it didn't stop them from doing what they wanted and having really fulfilling lives. A friend of mine who went to architecture school and did not go into a lucrative branch of the field. It's a calculation. It shouldn't stop you dead in your tracks, but it should absolutely be something you think about.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And sorry, one more. But how can we go about administratively making it more available?
Raise taxes. Raise taxes.
Fair enough.
And listen, schools spend on all the wrong things. The one category of education spending, higher education spending, that's rising the slowest is instructional spending. But there's a reason why they do that. It's not because these administrators are stupid or nefarious. They're responding to the pressures that are being put on them. I keep saying raise taxes, and I'm not offering anything new. Here's something new. You guys are here, okay? If they're going to treat you like a customer, which is the screwed up thing, that they treat you like customers, you might as well act like customers. And you might as well organize and say to your administration, we want better pay for our teachers. We want more professors and fewer adjuncts. We want course offerings in these areas that you're not offering. Whatever it is you think is missing, use this opportunity to put pressure on them. Because they're not going to listen to me, but they might listen to you guys.
Thank you.
Okay? Yes.
Hi. So you talked a little bit about, actually, I guess you kind of talked for a while, about the self. Can you hear me? You just like, okay. So you talked a while about the self and the soul, and you said that the self isn't something that we just have, and that we need to be finding ourselves, and we need to create our souls, I guess, in a sense. And in order to do that, we need to establish this connection between the mind and the heart. Are you saying that we should literally be thinking about the things that we love, or what is this connection that you're saying that we need to make, and how do we go about doing it?
Right. So if you don't mind, I was careful to avoid saying finding yourself,
Right.
and careful to say building yourself. And what I'm talking about is thinking about what you love, but actually thinking about everything, just reflecting on your own experience. That's what I'm talking about. Noticing what's happening to you and thinking about what it means. Whether that means the decision that you made yesterday and how you feel about it, how something you said to a person, and how that's partly how you become a better person. You notice the way you're inflicting pain on other people in your lives, and you become aware of that. That's what my Jane Austen book was about. I was a young idiot. I was a guy. I was 26. I was a jerk. And for various reasons, including reading books, I started to become aware of how my behavior was affecting other people, and it helped me to start to become less of a jerk. That's just one small piece of it. But that's what I'm talking about. Self-awareness, self-reflection, introspection. Does this make sense?
Yeah, no.
Good. Okay. Someone's over there, right?
Hi. So I'm one of those that you mentioned who has a handful of majors and minors, and not because I'm wanting to make myself more impressive to others, but because I am kind of indecisive and like to learn a lot. And I guess I wanted to know what you think about just deciding where to go after college for someone who loves to learn and needs to find a job in a way to pay off these types of majors and minors that you're told consistently aren't super profitable, and people are asking what you want to do with that.
So the question is, what to do after college if you want to keep?
And how you decide to strike the balance of having a living and also doing what you love to do.
All I can say is that you're asking the right question, that I would never pretend that it isn't a balance that you have to strike. One thing I would say is the decisions you make this year about next year are not the final decisions you're going to make in your life. And unless you're on a pretty clear trajectory, which it sounds like you're not, just like I wasn't, you are going to probably be making decisions year by year or 2 years by 2 years for the next few years. And, I had an older adult mentor in my life who said the best time to be looking for a job is on your lunch break. In other words, have a job, and then think about the next one. I think that that's great advice. The first jobs you get out of college are probably going to be unsatisfying. You're probably going to be overeducated for them, so you're going to be underemployed. That's standard. That's not anything to freak out about. And then, you'll look around and see, where do I want to go from here? I think also deciding what you want to do with your life is something that you can't do until you're on the job market. And you start to learn about the world of work and what's out there and what you like to do. Like, do you like to work in groups? Do you like to work by yourself? There are all these questions that you can't start to answer until you're actually in the workforce. Is this helpful at all?
I think so.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes.
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture, and I look forward to reading your book. You kind of answered my question partially through her question, but this is a broader one. But the past 2 years, I have slowed down significantly and kind of stepped out of the rat race. And I've definitely been exploring more, reading a lot. I've become very spiritual, and I feel I've found myself, and I see that I want to take all of this knowledge and continue growing, and then also eventually figure out something creative to make of it and offer that. And but the thing is getting through it, and this is the part that you kind of already answered, is especially for people who are not a part of a privileged socioeconomic group, how is that, and then also it's you have to become more educated to see these different potentials and different opportunities that you can take to go around about this route. Like, I see myself taking more different alternative paths to get to that goal, so my question is for people who are of lower socioeconomic groups, how is that, how do they get that opportunity? How are they able to step out of a rat race, step out of be able to explore while you're in school, while not building up your resume to a level where you're can compete for a good job or what I mean?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that people from privileged backgrounds who go to fancy schools don't do it either. Because if anything, they're more driven by this frenzy of credentialism, this need to engage in this never-ending status competition. I mean, in the first instance, that's who the book was addressed to, if only because that was my experience, and saying, like, what are you freaking, why are you doing this? Why are you, it's certainly true that if you come from a privileged background, you do, or at least should, have more freedom. But as I think I've been trying to say, and that was kind of a stumbling beginning to my answer, freedom also has to do with inner freedom, right? And you can have all the financial freedom in the world and feel, and I've known many, many people like this, who feel more constrained than you do. I'm also going to say something else, which I've gotten some flack for saying. If you have less, it's easier to do with less. And growing up affluent can make it very hard. Generally speaking, it's hard to put up with less than you grew up with, which means the more you grew up with, in some ways, the fewer options you have. Again, whatever the practicalities of your life are, that's what they are. But at this point in your life, all you need to do is support yourself, maybe put in the payments on your student loans, whatever those are. Just worry about that for now, I would say. It sounds like you've already made a good start in finding your way in the world and shutting out all the messages that are stopping you from doing that. I would say don't worry. Don't look too far into the future, because you don't know what the future is going to bring. Do the things that seem right now. Does that make sense?
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for speaking this evening. My question is tangentially related to hers.
Is that my book you're holding?
No, this is my book, sorry.
Oh.
My notebook.
Okay. Okay.
Tangent.
I think you're holding it like the Bible. I was worried.
Right.
Okay.
My notes are here.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
MOOCs, massively open online courses, were a little bit skirted at the beginning of your talk, and there are a lot of good reasons to skirt them, or in some ways not consider them a threat to the orthodoxies of educational communities yet, right? But the costs of going to college these days and the debt that's associated with that and the other problems are also a good reason not to engage in those systems. And so my question is two parts. First, is it possible to create an intellectual class or intelligentsia outside of academia? And secondly, in the absence of traditional learning communities, how can we construct communities that encourage learning in the same way that you're talking about it, like the pursuit of the liberal arts outside of academia?
You do realize I don't have all the answers, right? I mean, you guys are asking me really hard questions.
Let me rephrase.
No, you don't have to rephrase. I understood what you were asking me.
Could you offer any suggestions for doing so?
You know, here's the thing. Believe me, I know we've been talking about this. Higher education is really screwed up. And I understand the impulse to say, why don't we just throw the whole thing out and start over again? Or why don't I at least walk away from it? And the thing is that however screwed up it is, higher education has a massive infrastructure for at least the potential delivery of real learning. And it's developed over literally centuries. And whatever the funding priorities are, there's still, a lot of humanities professors here who are drawing paychecks, and a lot of students, and a lot of classrooms, and a lot of resources. It takes a long time to build those up and to sort of, leave the church, as it were, and go into the wilderness with a small flock. It might be the right choice, but it kind of means losing. It kind of means abandoning the vast majority of people who are now in college because it's not scalable. I mean, I went to, Deep Springs College, 26 students in the middle of fucking nowhere on the eastern side of the Sierras. Like, literally, you have to drive for 4 hours from any city to get to it. It's 100 years old. It's an incredibly intense place. It's free because it's self-sustaining, but it's 26 students. Listen, there's a lot of innovation happening in higher ed now, and people doing all kinds of interesting things. But, if we're ever going to, this is one of the reasons, by the way, that I don't like the way public solutions are being replaced by private solutions. The scale is just completely different, right? So.
Hey, man. This might be a horseshit question, sort of, but I showed up last week and sat here. Right, exactly. Close it out with. And I showed up last week and sat here for about 15 minutes before I realized it wasn't happening, and must have just read the date wrong. So why not indulge, But your remarks on the self brought to mind Mishima's work to me, like The Sea of Fertility, and seeing Kawabata's work as well. But and a Deep Springs alumnus, Bill Pullman, recently wrote that Nishima's work was like being recognized as one of the great works of the 20th century, which kind of made me laugh. Like who's doing this recognizing? But I don't know. I was just wondering if those authors meant anything to you, and what your thoughts.
I have to confess that I mean I know the names. I haven't really. I'm not going to pretend that I've read them. I haven't. It makes me want to. I mean, I've wanted to read Mishima for a long time. Tell me one or two things that make the connection for you, and that you think are valuable here.
I mean his. Maybe your joke about feeling like in a time capsule or something. Maybe Mishima isn't what you bring up in polite conversation or something. Or the.
Because he was a crazy fascist.
Right, exactly. But this perception of it, but he wasn't, a fascist really. But it's funny. But his ideas of the self and being like typecast as some based on the culture that you're a part of or something, and conformity and stuff. And I think maybe that's what Bowman was getting at in his work pertaining to contemporary culture as it being interesting to him. But
listen, I mean, I love that we're having this conversation. This is what it's supposed to be about, and I think there's this kind of subterranean communication system that connects the past to the present and the present to the future, and it often does so often happen, if not outside of, then despite the institutions. Right? It's almost like the purpose of the institution is to enable people to find their way in the interstices of the institutional world, so we can have this kind of secret conversation where we're still talking about books, and we're still talking about books that are more than 6 months old. And I don't want to end on a hopeful note because I think that's too easy a reflex. But listen, I mean, I think but this is the last thing that I'll say. The thing, or maybe not the last thing, but the thing that makes me hopeful is the recognition that curiosity, I do think it's innate. I do think it's an ever renewable resource. I think that young people, given the slightest chance, want to think about these things and talk about these things. So there's always a constituency that it just needs to be tapped into, I think.
Have you heard of Dr. Warren Farrell? I've been to his website and homepage. He's been active in the women's movement in the 70s in New York City and an educator for 40 years. But on his website, his homepage, he has a graph showing 1970 college graduates being 60% male and 40% female, and one for 2018 showing United States college graduates to be 60% female and 40% male. Do you think that's true? And he's petitioning that there's been a flip, from 50% greater male to now 50% greater female in college grads, and he's petitioning the Obama White House with a number of other people without a whole lot of success so far to create a national commission on boys, because I guess boys are not performing well in the current education system. That's my first question. My second one is on taxes. What would you think about the idea of a wealth tax instead of an income tax? The income tax comes each year, and in a sense it keeps more people who maybe are earning $250,000 a year, and I have a brother who's like that, who struggles, has a lot of financial stress between his family and kids in college, and got slammed with the housing thing. And then I think about how many, the uber wealthy, the 1%, and they get to, what do you think about the idea of a tax on wealth rather than a yearly income tax?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily instead of a yearly income tax. But certainly in addition, I mean, look, the truth is we have a wealth tax. It's called property taxes. But the only property that's taxed is real property, right? So it's not, it really is a tax on the middle class, right? Because as a percentage of total wealth, either if you're too poor, you don't own a house, and if you're rich, it's a small part of your wealth. So yes, I think a wealth tax is a great idea, not necessarily exclusively. As for your first question, I think it's tangential to what I'm talking about. The problem, the problem that boys seem to be dropping out of. I mean, people have written about this. People have talked about this. I'm not sure I know what the right answer is, but it seems like we are moving to an economy that, favors the kinds of things that women seem to be better at.
I mean, is the 60-40 true?
Yes, it is true. It's true, and it's roughly also true of graduate degrees, right? Yeah. Whether it's because boys can't sit still, or I don't know what it is. I mean, one impulse is to say tough shit. We weren't upset when the opposite was true. So now all of a sudden we're worried about boys, but I'm not a tough shit kind of person. I mean, I think if boys are having trouble getting through school, we should pay attention to that too, even though we should be also very happy that women are going to college in such great numbers. But yeah, it is true. Yeah. Okay.